In this video, we are going to do an overview of the web app that we are going to be building in this section. So in this section, we are going to build a very simple web-based application. So what's going to happen is we are going to be talking via a web browser. It doesn't matter which browser you use, but we are going to be talking to a Spring Boot application that is going to be listening on port 8080. So normally the default is 80. Here, traditionally Java applications will start up on 8080. That's a long time standard for Java application servers. And Spring Boot does have an embedded Tomcat server, and it is going to, by default, listen on 8080. What happens is Tomcat listens on 8080 and then routes the request to the Spring Boot application. And being that it is a web browser, Spring Boot is going to be responding with HTML, and everything's going to be handled by HTTP. So we're going to be following the standards on there. Just want to set the expectations. In this section, we are going to be building a very basic web application for consumption by a web browser. So we'll be following HTTP and also using HTML. Now, the runtime environment, that does get a little more interesting. Just to help you visualize what's going to be happening when we start it, you're going to have your host operating system when you start up the Spring Boot application. Obviously, that's going to be running within the JVM. Within the JVM, Tomcat will start up an embedded Tomcat instance, and within Tomcat, Spring Boot will be executing. So that'll start up as an application within Tomcat. And what happens when a request comes in, that request is going to get routed to a Spring MVC controller. We will have a service layer that we'll write that will handle that request, or the controller actually handles the request, but the request gets passed to a service. And when we are doing database operations, we will be using Spring Data JPA repositories. So you'll see that we write the repository interface. Actually, the implementation is provided by Spring Data JPA. You can see as we get over to the right-hand side of the screen there, I do have a dotted box of framework generated. That is going to be all generated for us, so we don't have to write any SQL code at all. That will be handled by Spring Data JPA and the Hibernate implementation. And then, of course, underneath the covers, Hibernate is going to be utilizing JDBC and will be generating the SQL to talk to the H2 in-memory database. So the application that we are building is going to be talking to an in-memory database, and that coordination with the database is going to be handled by Hibernate, which implements the JPA standard. Now, once we get the data out of the database, that request is going to be passed back up the chain through the repository service layer. The Spring MVC controller will provide data back to the Timeleaf engine, and then that's going to generate, the Timeleaf engine will generate the HTML response for the browser to consume. To help you visualize the components that we will be writing, we generally follow this design pattern. So we will create packages for controllers, services, repositories, and domain. So within the controllers package, we'll have Spring MVC controllers. Services are going to be custom services. And the services would typically write to an interface and then create an implementation. Later in the course, you'll see how this becomes more important for dependency injection to be writing to an interface. So a lot of times you don't do controllers in an interface because you don't have any need to be performing dependency injection on them. However, services, it's very common to write multiple implementations of services, so we will follow that design pattern inside this course. And then repositories, you'll see coming up in the course, you provide an interface for the repository, and Spring Data JPA will generate the implementation. And then finally, we will have a package called domain. And within that package, we will create POJOs, plain old Java objects, which are just objects with properties and getters and setters. And we will configure those to be JPA entities that JPA/Hibernate will use for persistence operations. So this is just to give you an overview of what we are doing in this section of the course. And coming up, we will start implementing each piece of this. So we'll start off with the domain objects, start mapping those up, and then we will develop the rest of the application. By the end of the section, we will have a web application that allows you to persist and retrieve data from the in-memory database.